Thank you for downloading episode 39 of the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast. Before we begin, here's a brief charity appeal on behalf of Murder Mile. This is Michael. He's a 42-year-old podcaster. He's fat, bald, and very, very single. Chained to a laptop, 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, Michael is forced to make exquisite true crime podcasts for no money, no food, and very few 5-star reviews. But with a small donation of just $3 a month, you can keep this fat, bald loser alive. Help him cover his exorbitant costs of producing award-nominated podcasts. Allow him a little bit of a social life, and provide him with some of life's essentials, like beer, curry, Bakewell tarts, and many, many photos of Eva Green. Subscribe to Patreon today, and don't let a podcaster needlessly die. Unless their death is grisly, funny, and you can make a podcast series out of it. Obviously. Thank you for your support, and enjoy the episode. Welcome to Murder Mile, a true crime podcast, an audio-guided walk featuring many of London's untold, unsolved, and long-forgotten murders, all set within 1 square mile of the West End. Today's episode is about George Thomas Pickering, a hard-working husband and doting father of 3, who was the epitome of a Jekyll and Hyde character, and whose mania led him to brutally slay a Soho sex worker called Rosa O'Neill. And yet, why he killed her remains the real mystery. Murder Mile contains upsetting details which may cause the easily startled to spew, as well as realistic sounds, so that no matter where you listen to this podcast, you'll feel like you're actually there. My name is Michael. I am your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 39, George Thomas Pickering, the Silent Killer. Today, I'm standing on Brewer Street in Soho, W1. 1 road north of the White Horse Public House, where Larry Winters gunned down Paddy O'Keefe. 1 road west of the bombing of the Admiral Duncan. And 2 roads north of the unsolved killing of police informer Black Rita. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Originally called Wells Street, although this single-lane side street is barely 1,200 feet long, as home to the now-defunct and demolished Ayres and Davies breweries, Wells Street was renamed Brewer Street. But for at least the last century, being crammed full of seedy sex shops and sweaty strip joints, all of which are occupied by spunky-handed willy fiddlers in dirty flashing Macs. Surely it's time to rename this mucky Soho backstreet with a more appropriate moniker, like Pervert's Parade, Wanker's Way, Spooge Street, or Jizzy Junction. Today, number 12 Brewer Street is called Soho's Original Bookshop, and as a deeply dull, 3-story brown brick building. Instantly, your eyes are drawn to its dark green wooden facade on the ground floor and its garish neon signs, which flash forth with words like sex shop and XXX. Featuring a wealth of arty erotica for the more discerning pervert, downstairs is a veritable pornucopia of mucky mags, dirty DVDs, pep pills for your Percy Plonker, Vavavoom juice for your vajayjay, and chocolate mousse for your rusty bullet hole, as well as all manner of strange shit with spikes, crazy crap with clamps, and if you've got £150 to spare, a life-sized and very realistic rubber bum hole. Apparently. And yet, as much as this building is synonymous with sex, it's also the home of death. As it was here, on Monday the 7th of October 1963, in the first floor flat of number 12 Brewer Street, that Rosa O'Neill was savagely slaughtered by a silent killer. On Tuesday the 19th of November 1963, in the cold, sterile surgery of Brixton Prison, dressed in oversized prison fatigues and a pair of slip-on shoes, sat 26-year-old George Thomas Pickering. With short curly brown hair, a cheeky grin, and arched eyebrows which gave his impish little face an eternally surprised expression. Being barely 5 foot and 6 inches tall, George didn't look like a major criminal, and yet, as a Category A prisoner, he was considered one of the worst. "George?" Dr. F.H. Brisby, the medical officer, asked. But as the prisoner's bloodshot eyes glared down at his guilt-ridden hands, he ignored him. But not owing to ignorance or the arrogance of a hardened con who refused to spill the beans to a screw, but because George was trapped in a world of silence. As being both deaf and mute, George heard no words and could say nothing in reply. "George?" Dr. Brisby asked, as he softly tapped the tearful prisoner's shoulder, stirring this broken man from those bloody visions forever burned into his retina. "George, that day, did you know what you were doing?" he asked. But George didn't reply. Not as a false ruse to secure an insanity plea, a ploy which his lawyer had toyed with, and the prison warden had taken seriously, having confiscated his belt, his tie, his shoelaces, and placed him for the last 6 weeks on suicide watch. But the delay was solely so his interpreter could translate the words that he could neither hear nor speak. But being polite, Dr. Brisby got the reply he expected, as George simply nodded, yes. "George, did you know it was wrong?" Dr. Brisby asked. As being 8 days away from his murder trial at the Old Bailey, the doctor's question would be the difference between life and a death sentence. George simply nodded, yes. And yet, in a police investigation which was short, swift, and thrift, although George's guilt was guaranteed, one question remained unanswered. "George, if you knew all that, then why did you murder Rosa O'Neill?" In the ungodly hours of the 21st of February 1937, a high-pitched scream wailed down the maternity ward at Stanmore Hospital. But this was not a cry of death, but of birth. And with his vocal cords set to loud, and 2 fully functional ears, which heard his beloved mother slowly soothe her baby boy to sleep, into the world came George Thomas Pickering, and he was perfect in every way. Hailing from the seaside town of Scarborough in Yorkshire, Margaret and Reginald Pickering were two doting parents to their beloved son, George. And with no history of disability, criminality, or mental illness in the family, these were good people, solid, proud, and stoic. But for the Pickering family, a major test was yet to come. After weeks of stiffness, dizziness, insomnia, and vomiting, 4-year-old George was rushed to hospital, gripped in a fit of fever, as bacterial meningitis strangled his spinal cord and, like a halo of death, slowly crushed his brain. And although his young life was saved by antibiotics, by the time he'd left hospital, the damage had been done. And being left deaf, mute, and crippled by chronic headaches, the last sound that George ever uttered or heard were his own tears, as his whole world descended into silence. Eager to ensure that their son wasn't hindered by his disabilities, and that he'd retain his confidence, pride, and independence, Margaret and Reginald enrolled George at the Royal Deaf and Dumb School in Margate on England's south coast, where he learned to sign, made new friends, and as a better-than-average student, he left school aged 16 with a lust for life and a passion for woodwork. And as a solid young man who did his parents proud, George lived a very normal, happy and productive life. Having graduated, George trained as a carpenter for Kodak in northwest London. But as a recently married man and father to twin daughters and soon a son, eager to be near his family, George uprooted and found new employment at Humphreys, a furniture maker's in New Malden. Life was good. He had an honest job, 3 healthy children, and lived in a delightful little terraced house on a pleasant tree-lined street at number 15 Oxford Avenue, with his wife Beryl, who was also deaf and mute. And although he had cheated death and coped with disability, the meningitis had done its damage. And being crippled by headaches, the older he got, the worse they became. And as his painkillers proved pointless, they were quickly replaced by alcohol to quell his pain. But like all drugs, drink had its downside. On the 20th of February 1957, George was arrested for being drunk and disorderly, causing willful damage, and inflicting grievous bodily harm in an unprovoked attack. He was bound over by the courts for 2 years. On the 15th of August 1961, George smashed up his furniture at work with an axe and was committed to Shenley Psychiatric Hospital, where even though he was tearful, tense, and complained of being racked with deep bouts of depression, suicidal thoughts, and unnaturally violent urges, he was discharged after just 24 hours, and the incident was blamed on drink. 4 weeks later, whilst heavily intoxicated, George was arrested for inflicting grievous bodily harm in an unprovoked attack on a West End prostitute. He was sentenced to 2 months in prison. Later that year, whilst carving up the Christmas turkey, George had to be physically restrained by his family, as in an unprovoked fit of depression and rage, he tried to slit open his wrists. prior to his murder trial, George said to Dr. F.H. Brisby of Brixton Prison that he felt like Jekyll and Hyde, part man and part monster, with one side of him as a good father and a loyal husband, and the other side was a violent, drunken, homicidal maniac. Desperate to quell his uncontrollably violent urges, George quit drinking, and for almost a year, life returned to normal. But without a steady hit of booze to dull the incessant throbbing in his head. His insomnia increased, his depression darkened, and suicide seemed a better prospect than living. 2 years later, being at his wit's end, George Thomas Pickering made the unfortunate decision to take his own life. But strangely, it wasn't he who would ultimately end up dead. The following is based on the original police investigation files, autopsy report, witness statements, and George's own hazy and confused recollection of the events that day, so some details are patchy. By the morning of Monday the 7th of October 1963, George hadn't slept for 3 whole days. And although his kids cried, with wide cracked eyes which glared vacantly at the ceiling, the only sound he heard was the dull thud as blood erratically pumped from his fluctuating heart to his throbbing head. Feeling like his body was a dead weight, with his head like lead, his feet like they were stuck in peat, and his limp arms like they were anchored to the bed, George lay prostrate, an empty, hollow man devoid of hope. But as a good dad, with bills to pay, a mouth to feed, as George crawled out of bed and his lifeless legs thudded to the floor, he didn't feel like he normally did. He felt strange. It started like any ordinary day, only slower and less certain, as all he could think of was his own death. For the last time, he hugged his kids. Their voices he had never heard before, and their sweet faces he would never see again. And as his soundless lips softly kissed Beryl's cheek, he left his home for the very last time, never to return. At 7:30 a.m, George walked out of 15 Oxford Avenue and trudged south to Kingston Road. The sky was dull, grey, and full of foreboding as dark, ominous clouds loomed large. And as the interminable British drizzle soaked him to the bone, on any other day he would have turned right and headed off to work at Humphreys. But in a rash decision, which would ruin his life forever, he turned left. At 7:45 a.m, as he stood alone on the packed platform of Rains Park Station, isolated and trapped in a solitary, silent world, feeling the violent rumble under his feet as the train thundered near, as he stared at the bare track, he pictured 200 tons of roaring steel wheels slicing over his soft neck, severing his head and leaving behind a lifeless, bloody stump. But his feet wouldn't budge. By 8:10 a.m, as his train sidled into Waterloo Station. George lumbered aimlessly towards a Strand, on the south side of the West End, but with his full focus being on what way was best to meet his death, as the hard heavy thump of his boots sent a dull throbbing pain to his brain, with his every movement making him even more nauseous. Although he'd been teetotal for weeks, his only thought was the pain-free lure of liquor. And then, for the next 3 hours, George disappeared. No one knows where he went, or what he did. Not even he. But with every pub and off-licence closed until lunch, at 11 a.m., by the time that he had stumbled into Soho, George was drunk. And being part man and part monster, as the meek, mild, and timid man within slunk into the shadows, the other side of his Jekyll and Hyde took over. At a little after 11:30 a.m., having staggered past the White Horse pub and stumbled into Edward Roche & Co., an off-licence at 33 Shaftesbury Avenue, having handed over 17 shillings, the only sound that George heard was a heavy gulping as he necked back great glugs of 66% proof vodka. Being deaf, dumb, and now blind drunk, George stumbled into the garish neon haze of the nearby Cameo Moulin Cinema to watch Women by Night, a tawdry sexploitation film full of tits, tush, and tassels. But as his glazed-over eyes gazed at the soundless screen, ogling bums and boobs, amongst a salty sea of sad bastards whose hands bobbed in their pants like they'd all lost their last pound, George hated what he saw, where he was, and who he had become. And as his suicidal thoughts stewed, so too were his unnatural urges and strange stirrings within, as bubbling to the surface came a hatred, a rage, and an uncontrollable desire for violence. Desperate to die, at a little after 1 p.m, George staggered into Cutler's Toolmakers at 52 Brewer Street. He pointed to a shiny stainless steel blade, and having handed over 10 shillings, he stumbled out into the bustle of Brewer Street, one step nearer to slitting his wrists. What happened next is debatable, as with no slashes on his arms, cuts to his neck, or puncture wounds on his body, George suddenly decided to forego his suicide, and instead headed east to number 12 Brewer Street, where Soho's original bookshop now sits, and where George would fulfill a very different and uncontrollable urge. On the ground floor, to the left of the store, was a black wooden door. Instinctively, although he would never hear it, George rung the bell and waited in the doorway as he swayed unsteadily on his feet. Opened by the housekeeper, Sophie Georgina Willis. Without a sound, just a smile, she ushered him up to the first floor, with a wave which said, "You know the way." Having visited her several times prior, George always liked Rosa, as being one of the few Soho sex workers who didn't mock, pity, or shun him. He liked Rosa, and with no airs, no graces, and no pretense. To many young men, she was just a nice lady. As George drunkenly stumbled up the white wooden staircase, bouncing off the floral wallpaper, and almost tripping up over the soft green carpeting underfoot, at the top of the stairs stood Rosa O'Neill. Being 5'4" at a push, 14 stone at her lightest, and with a motherly yet matronly face, dressed in a pink quilted dressing gown and slippers, she smiled and welcomed him in. But being part man and part monster, with the meek, mild, and timid man having shifted into the shadows, and the other side of this Jekyll and Hyde now making strange stirrings within. As from his heart to his head, his blood heavily thumped. Inside pumped a dark and hollow rage. George would later state, "I don't know what happened. I just went berserk." With his eyes wild and his knuckles white, from inside of his blue corduroy jacket, George pulled the filleting knife. With his left hand, having roughly grabbed the scruff of her bathrobe to steady his terrified target, having raised the blade high, he plunged the full length of the 6-inch steel deep into the left of Rosa's chest. And using all of his force, anger, hatred, and rage, he repeatedly stabbed the sliver of stainless steel into her torso, slashing at her flailing arms and slicing her splayed fingers, as the bloodied blade sunk 4 inches deep into her right lung, her liver, and her gut. Desperate to fight off her frenzied attacker, as Rosa shoved her short assassin over the soft green carpeting underneath, George stumbled, and as his sticky red hands left thick bloody smears over the white wood, Rosa slammed the door shut, and George fled. As her housekeeper rang the alarm, Rosa lay face up on the bed, a damp flannel on her forehead to cool her sweaty brow. As wrapped in a duvet, she was suddenly gripped with the icy cold chill, as slowly her body drained of blood. And although they had called for a doctor, by the time that he had arrived, just 7 minutes later, Rosa O'Neill was dead. Although the previous day was a booze-soaked blur, seeing his clothes crumpled on the floor, his dirty corduroy caked in crusted blood, George realized he had done something truly awful. And being racked with guilt, having unsuccessfully tried to kill himself by swallowing 300 aspirins, George handed himself in at Wimbledon police station. Having fully confessed to the crime, with a wealth of evidence, and having been identified by 3 witnesses, on the 27th of November 1963, George Thomas Pickering was found guilty of manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility, and was sentenced to life in prison. 4 years later, eager to quell the thundering headaches which had haunted his every waking moment since the spinal meningitis had robbed him of all speech and sound, on Tuesday the 8th of May 1967, in the D-Wing rec room of Wormwood Scrubs prison, having no access to alcohol to halt the incessant hammering in his head, George drank a homemade cocktail made from orange juice and copier fluid. And as the mix of acetone and methylated spirits inflamed his stomach, drowned his lungs, and as he drifted into a coma, having already been rendered deaf and mute by illness. In a sad twist of irony, the booze, which blocked the throbbing in his brain, had robbed him of another sense and rendered him blind. And after a slow and agonizing death, which lasted almost a week, on Sunday the 14th of May 1967, George Thomas Pickering died of alcohol poisoning. And once again, his whole world was silent. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for listening to Murder Mile. Don't forget to stay tuned to Extra Mile after the break. But before that, here's my recommended podcast of the week, which is Red Handed.
Hi, we're Hannah
and Thruti
from Red Handed,
the true crime podcast asking the questions no one else is asking.
We come at you every week covering everything from barely known crimes
to revolutionary cases. But whatever we're discussing, we dig into the social, cultural and societal aspects of every story.
And still have you feeling like you're just down the pub with your mates. Listen and subscribe on Acast,
Apple Podcasts,
or wherever you get your podcasts.
And if you're ever in London, why not book a ticket onto my 5-star rated Murder Mile walks? It's a guided walk of Soho's most infamous murder cases. You also get to see my big fat bald head, and you get to say, "Oh, is that what he looks like? Ah, that's a shame." Murder Mile was researched, written and performed by myself, with the main musical themes written and performed by Eric Stein and John Books of Cult with No Name. Thank you for listening, and sleep well. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning to you. Of course, if this is an afternoon, then I should really be saying good afternoon, or if it's the evening, good evening. So really, that song didn't make any sense at all. Why did I do it? I have no idea. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Murder Mile. Murder Mile? Not Murder Mile, Extra Mile. See, for new people, that would be cut out instantly, because, see, I'm not going off script. This is unscripted, unedited. There's no music, there's no sounds. This is just me talking about the case we just discussed. It's not compulsory. You don't have to listen to it. You can switch off if you want to. You probably already have. You probably already have by that point. You probably listened to the adverts, if there was adverts, and gone, ugh, adverts, boring, ugh. But if you're looking for more details about the case, obviously there's a lot of things that I can't discuss in the story because it slows down the story, so I save it for Extra Mile. So this is for those lovely, lovely patient people who are like, I want to listen to Extra Mile. Lots of people enjoy Extra Mile. I don't get it. I do get it in a way. I get it because it's entirely different to the first part, and it's a very honest part. Do you know, I think everyone who listens to it on a regular basis knows that it's very honest. I keep everything in. It's not contrived. I don't sit down and plan anything. I have a couple of little notes in front of me just to, because my brain is, I have a very awful attention span. I get very distracted. I'm not very good at remembering things, which is odd considering my job, but I have a very retentive memory for other stuff as well. So I forgot what I was talking about. So so Murder Mile really is, it's for you guys. If you enjoy all these extra details, then this is why Extra Mile is here. I find it quite therapeutic as well. I quite enjoy it after the having to write and research and concentrate and rehearse the lines to try and get it as near as possible so I don't, because as a dyslexic I tend to stutter over things. That recording wasn't too bad actually. Although it is a very hot day, it's 31 degrees in the boat today. I had to close all the windows and doors to block out the sound because it's a nice sunny day outside. Every single bastard who has too much money, has decided to buy themselves a crappy little airplane, like a little 2-seater or a 1-seater, or they're all out today, and because they don't know how to navigate, they know how to fly, but they don't know how to navigate. They use the canal to guide them from the small airfields up in Middlesex and Essex, where I am, down into, they fly over the City of London. So they're all out today, but there doesn't seem to be any now, which is always the way with Extra Mile. So, Extra Mile, let's dive into this case. This was, I was about to say Larry Winters, it's not. God, I'm doing too many cases at the same time. This is the story of George Thomas Pickering, 26-year-old man who was deaf and mute owing to spinal meningitis when he was 4 years old, which I thought was an interesting detail. When I was going through the case, I was like, oh, I wonder. When I found that detail, I was like, oh, God, that's fantastic. Let me back up the truck a little bit. I found this case solely because I have to go past Brewer Street all the time on my tours, and, obviously, it's near all of the murder locations. I thought to myself, given the fact that it was a street synonymous with, like, sex workers and sex shops and perverts and all stuff like that, I thought there's got to be a murder on Brewer Street. So I was in the National Archives and I typed in, into their search database, it was Brewer Street murder. And there it was. It was a murder I'd never heard of, which is George Thomas Pickering murdered Rosa O'Neill. Didn't know anything about it. Grabbed the murder file, which is what I love doing. I love just opening up the file, knowing nothing about the case except date and location, which for me is a good start. That means a high chance it will be on the podcast, unless it's shit. Some podcasts some episodes I've researched, and they will not end up on the podcast because they're boring. But this one I found interesting. I was like, okay, it's an interesting case. Going through all the details, and when I found out he was deaf and mute, I was like, okay, I'm in. I think that makes for a nice, different kind of murderer. Someone who can't hear and can't, has lost his own ability to communicate with everyone else around him, and can only really communicate with people who can sign. There was a technical detail I put in there which I should probably clarify. I mentioned that when he was first arrested for being drunk and disorderly... Oh, look, a little boat going past. Sounds good. It's got a nice engine. Nice little hum on it. Right. He see, easily distracted. When he was first arrested for being drunk and disorderly, he was, instead of being sent to prison because it was a first offence, he was bound over by the courts for 2 years. And bound over is kind of an old technical term, and what it means is basically he was put on probation because it was a first offence. Instead of sending him to prison, what they say is, right, the judge says, you've committed this offence. If you commit another offence within this period of time, so within 2 years, the punishment will be worse. You will serve the punishment for that crime and this crime combined. But he didn't. As far as we know, he didn't commit another offence. So that was him being bound over. Thought I'd explain that. Interestingly, when he was arrested on the third time, so he smashed up his work at Kodak, which was interesting. That his work actually took him back, but he said they took him back even though he smashed up all his furniture at work, and then he was put into Shenley Psychiatric Hospital for about 24 hours. He said they took him back, but according to my details, he started at Humphreys, the furniture makers, about 2 weeks after that. So whether they took him back or whether he resigned, I don't know. This is one detail I can't work out. But, okay, on the third occasion when he attacked the prostitute, the West End prostitute, he had to serve 2 months in prison. He served only 1, and that was in Brixton Prison. Now, I didn't mention this in the story because I realised that going back and forth between dates, it kind of confuses things quite often. So this was 1961, 2 years before he murdered Rosa O'Neill. He was in Brixton Prison, serving time there. Dr. F.H. Brisby, I hope you enjoyed the accent that I tried to pull off then. That was a kind of a light Sean Connery. George. I'm probably going to have to redo that because it probably sounds shit. But Dr. F.H. Brisby examined George 2 years prior to the murder in his surgery in Brixton Prison. And he gave him an EKG, so like the heart monitor thing, so he can do a readout of his heart. And he noticed that George had an irregular heart rate, which was consistent with those who suffer with violent urges or suffer from violent behaviour. And it seemed to be, he couldn't find out whether it was a hereditary heart rate or whether it was based around the fact that he had spinal meningitis, which they believe a lot of George's problems, such as the deafness, being mute, and his headaches and his rages, they reckon it was all caused by the spinal meningitis, which had done a lot of damage by the time he got the antibiotics. Another thing that I thought I'd mention in that, I mentioned this on the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast discussion group, slurp of tea. Oh, it's cold. Was what I try to do on all these podcasts is try and get the details as accurate as possible, not just about the murder, not just about the people, not just about the clothes they're wearing, things like that, but also the weather report. So, for example, on this one, I knew exactly what day it was and where everyone was based. So, because the Met Office, the British Met Office, have a very good kind of historical backlog of kind of all their data since, I can't remember when the Met Office originally started, but weather information has been kept for hundreds of years in this country. So what I did was I went back to the day of the murder, checked for London, and it said it was overcast. It had been raining for about 3 or 4 days prior, but it had gone into a typical British drizzle, and there was a bit of a light frost as well. So I put that into the podcast. That's what I like to do, is if the weather says it's stormy and wet, I'll put in stormy and wet. If it's bright and hot, I'll put in bright and hot. The only time I've done that with all the previous podcasts, the only time I didn't do that was in the Martine Vig Magnussen one. Whereas if you noticed at the end, as her father was coming back over to the United Kingdom, I put in the sounds of kind of wind and rain and thunder, and that wasn't the weather for that night. That was really a kind of a recollection back to the beginning of the story, when we were talking about that her father, Martin Vig Magnussen's father, when she was born, it was windy and rainy, and he was driving his car at super fast speed to get to Oslo Hospital to make sure his daughter was born. So that was just a reflection. I reflected it in the end of the story, just so it would trigger something in your brain. But apart from that, that's what I try and do in all of these episodes, is to try and get things accurate. Another thing that was accurate was 12 Brewer Street. So although it is now called Soho Original Bookstores, and was originally prior to that called Doc Hollywood's Love Shop and Cinema, nice title. It wasn't in 1963, so I think I might have mentioned it in this podcast, but I'm not. No, actually, I might have edited it out. I can't remember. I will look. But number 12 Brewer Street, on the ground floor, back in October 1963, was a shop called Soho Money Savers. And what it did was it sold discounted household items such as Pledge, Ajax, and Brillo pads. Which was very interesting. So even though the street was full of prostitutes and there were some sex shops, but not many, because it was still very much frowned on. There was still, it was all kind of, remember in the Richard Rhodes Henley case, loads of bookshops, inverted commas, bookshops, of which in the back there would be kind of mucky magazines. It was, but this was Soho Money Savers. I'm trying to find a bigger picture of Soho Money Savers on the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast discussion group, and on, especially with if you're a Patreon supporter as well, I will be posting loads of crime scene photos. I'll do a side-by-side. I'll try and do a side-by-side one of the door that you entered through, because the door still looks the same today, except today it's kind of brown wood instead of a dark black. But you can see a little bit of Soho Money Savers there, which is quite interesting. And there's some crime scene photos. Some of them are unpleasant, so I do warn you now about that. They have they've done a plan of the flat, so you can see where he came up the stairs and when he went in. There's a nice shot of the door that Rosa O'Neill opened to welcome George in, and the door that she shut him out of, and you can see all of his very bloody handprints on the door. And there's a couple of photos there as well, which I warn you aren't pleasant now, which is Rosa O'Neill lying on the bed. She's got the kind of the flannel on her forehead because she was burning up. I think it was Sophie, the housekeeper, who put the flannel on her head. Or it might have been Mrs. Yvonne Plattel, who was actually the neighbour upstairs. I didn't add her into the story because you've already been introduced to Sophie, and I thought, why introduce you to Mrs. Yvonne Plattel, who lived on the second floor? It just kind of threw things off. And so there is a photo of Rosa O'Neill lying on the bed with a duvet on top of her. She's partially naked, and you can see that she's got a lot of stab wounds on her to her arms, and it's there that she died. But I warn you now, it's not pleasant. And in the corner of the shot, if you look carefully, you can see the knife that George dropped. He dropped it in the bedroom just by a little armchair. No, a little wooden chair. So but you've got to look closely for that. Anyway, those are the crime scene photos on Instagram. I'll put some on Instagram and on Facebook as well. But extra stuff for people who are Patreon listeners. Ha! So, Rosa O'Neill. Normally I would go into a back history about the victim that I'd normally do. This time I decided not to. Not because I didn't sympathise with her at all, but just because it was really difficult to find information about Rosa. So Rosa's real name, not Rosa O'Neill, her real name was excuse me, Rosa Michaelu. She was born sometime in the end of 1921, which means she was 42 years old, originally from Poland. She married a gentleman called Bernard Joseph O'Neill. He was born in 1904, so he was 15 years older than her. He was Irish, a market trader who lived at 251A West End Lane in West Hampstead. Now, they married in October 1958, so she'd been married 5 years. But it's stated that they didn't live together, and they pretty much had nothing to do with each other since the date of their marriage. So that would suggest that he was paid, or she'd paid him to marry her so she could get a passport to move into the country, or it was probably arranged for her. There was a lot of that going on around the time, a lot of illegal marriages to allow people passports to come into the country. But from what we know, she knew George, she liked him. She didn't mock him. She didn't pity him at all. She was just a very, very nice lady, and that's why he liked her. He'd been and seen her several times. He says 5 or 6 times, which is why he knew where she lived. He knew the door. Although quite why he killed her, we don't know. It's weird that being so full of rage and alcohol and hatred, especially for himself, and wanted to take it. That is a coot. For those who listen a lot, that is a coot. That's not the coot. That's not Don Juan the coot. That's just coot. And this one is not as noisy as the others. So yeah, no, he'd been full of rage and alcohol, and he tried to kill himself so many times, and yet it doesn't make sense why at that point, they said literally as soon as he walked through the door, he hadn't even been there a minute, and he said he just went berserk. His rage just erupted, and he stabbed Rosa to death multiple times. We don't know why. He doesn't know why. Rosa won't know why. People around him just don't know why. It's baffling. It's one of those mysteries. So yeah, we will never ever know. Thought I'd dive in a little bit more information on the end of the story, which was the death of George Thomas Pickering. This was quite interesting because I was going through the case file, the original police investigation file, the death of Rosa O'Neill, about George Pickering, and it was kind of unconclusive for me because it was kind of, he didn't get executed, he didn't say why he did it because he didn't know, and it was kind of, for me, I was like, I didn't really feel that there was an ending to it. So I simply just sat there and I was just like, right, I'm in the archives anyway, let's just type in George's name, and then it was like, oh, another murder case. It was another manslaughter case with George's name 4 years later. And I was like, oh, that's fantastic. And it was like, oh, George has been murdered in prison. Oh my God, that's fantastic. So I couldn't go into it in this story, but I'll go through as much as I can with it now. So, where were we? So this was all inside Wormwood Scrubs prison. He was originally sentenced to Wandsworth prison, but they moved him to Wormwood Scrubs. Now, obviously, he was looking for alcohol. He needed alcohol to quell his headaches. He hadn't been poisoned by people. Well, technically he had, but he hadn't been deliberately poisoned by people. This is what I thought at the start. I thought, oh my God, the three these people have been charged with his manslaughter. They must have poisoned him, but it wasn't. They were making illegal booze. So what happened is they were having what's called a drink-up session, which is hang on, let me back up a bit. All my details are here. So there were three. Let me check. There was a couple of men involved. So there was Gerald Francis George Creed of Coventry, who was a gas fitter, aged 23. He was found guilty previously of receiving stolen goods. He had a string of offences, mostly for burglary and housebreaking, and he was in prison for 6 years with wounding with intent using a knife. There was another man called Howard Henry Mitchell, who was 32, who was a labourer. He had a string of minor offences, mostly for motor vehicle theft and stealing scrap metal, but he'd been imprisoned for murder at the time. And Alan Frederick Potter, 32, a company director, who was what was he charged for? Charged for forging documents. And 7 years for manslaughter for strangling a girl in Leicester. Very unpleasant man. Now, Alan Frederick Potter was actually working in the tailor's shop at that time. Now, the tailor was away that week, so another man was put in charge of kind of ordering supplies. Now, Junisol, which was the copier fluid, is basically a transfer fluid that I mentioned that was used. It was a duplicating fluid as used in copying machines, and basically what they would do is when you've created a shape for kind of prison uniforms, because obviously everyone has different shapes and sizes, you'd use the Junisol to transfer that. People who know embroidery probably can say this better than I can. Basically, you put the shape onto the material, then you can cut round it afterwards. That's really what the Junisol is for. And because the tailor was away that week, Alan Frederick Potter was responsible, or one of the people responsible for ordering new stocks. And he actually deliberately over-ordered on the Junisol. And so what they would do is they'd get this Junisol, which, as I said, is about 37% methylated spirits and acetone and 37% methyl alcohol. And they'd mix it with orange juice. It'd be pretty lethal stuff. So you'd drink it in small quantities, and it's what people would do. You would sell it. 2 pints of that you'd sell for an ounce of tobacco, and this was kind of a very normal thing that would happen in prisons. It was illegal, but a lot of people would do it, and they would have a regular drink-up session. So they'd basically go into a cell when none of the prison guards were watching. You pull out your bottle, have a big old drink up, and everyone would get really pissed. And obviously, if you hide it well enough, the prison guards wouldn't know what you were doing. Obviously, George, who was about 30 by that age, he'd suffered with headaches since the age of 4, so that's 26 years. Always looking for something to cure his headaches. He'd always been a drinker to try and cure these headaches as well. Now, they were in D Wing in the rec room. They were getting massively pissed. They said that George, over dinner, he was uncontrollable. He was a real mess. He was stumbling everywhere. There was about 4 different people who were in a real mess that night. They really had gone absolutely bloody bonkers on it. I'm just going through my notes at the moment. So I haven't got their names here. This is really annoying. It's here, but I can't find it. So at 9:30 a.m. on the 15th of May 1967, Pickering was admitted to Wormwood Scrubs sick bay, complaining of vague pains in his head and stomach, mild dizziness, blurred vision, very rapid breathing. Dr. Patrick Galway, the medical officer at HMP Wormwood Prison, then admitted Pickering to Hammersmith Prison for further tests. By which time, by the evening, he had physically deteriorated severely and had to be readmitted to Hammersmith Hospital. Now, there was another prisoner involved in the drink-up called Patrick Willis. Now, I think there was 4 in total who had to be sent into hospital because they were all suffering with the symptoms that I mentioned about before. So inflammation of the stomach, headaches. Patrick Willis temporarily went blind on account of drinking this Junasol and orange juice mix. But all the 3 other prisoners managed to survive because they vomited. It was so bad and toxic to their stomach that they were just constantly vomiting. It doesn't actually say whether Patrick Willis was permanently blind, but everyone else managed to. They survived. They got well. There was a little bit of damage, but they survived. They managed to get through it. But George didn't. And the problem was, obviously George had been drinking so far throughout his life to cure his headaches that his body was really used to high levels of alcohol and being in prison, used to this thing like drinking Junasol. So his body was used to it. So it didn't vomit at all. He didn't throw up. He didn't chuck up all these toxins in his body. His body just absorbed them. And as the more alcohol he absorbed, the worse he got. So he went through a series of, they say, inflammation of the lower gullet, inflamed stomach, waterlogging of the lungs. He died by poisoning by methyl alcohol, and his symptoms included severe abdominal pain, blindness, respiratory failure, coma, and death. So that was the end of George. They said here that he was in D wing in the rec room for dinner. Pickering ran to the dinner table, stumbled, and fell flat onto his face. Another prisoner, Osborne, his name was, I haven't got his first name here, was sick 3 to 4 times, which saved his life. But obviously George didn't. All the men involved in that drink-up pleaded not guilty to manslaughter, and they were found not guilty as well, because obviously they didn't force the drink into George. George just kind of drank it himself. So I think they were found guilty for I can't remember what it was called. I've got it written. I've got so many notes on this case that I was planning to do a big thing on it, but I just ran out of time. I ran out of time and thought, it's not really that important that we get the full details on how George killed himself. But anyway, they were not found guilty of his manslaughter. And George was buried inside Wormwood Scrubs prison. So, I thought I'd get an interesting little diversion here. So, not last week's case, the case before, Helen Mary Pickwood, the abortion case. Now, obviously, I'd done a lot of research into that. It's a story that is very rarely told. And I had to go back and find the original files and dig into it deep. And I found a lot of information about Captain Edward Gerard Tickle, which was interesting about him, but I didn't really get to find out a lot of information about him after the murder. It was kind of hard to track down. And this is where a big thank you goes out to Matt C on Twitter. Thank you, Matt. Matt posed the question, because he listened to the details about Captain Edward Gerard Tickle, and he went, is this Gerard Tickle, the Irish writer? Now, interestingly, in that episode, I deliberately left a couple of things out. And one of the things was that Captain Edward Gerard Tickle had just really started his writing career by that point. He was writing books. That was his focus. He wanted to be a novelist. And one of his first books, which I'll mention very shortly, was actually used to fund the abortion for Helen Mary Pickwood. So let me go through what we managed to find online. Interestingly, there was a Wikipedia page. You know I hate Wikipedia, but you know what? In a case like this, I'm going to use it because it's details that I just don't have. Captain Edward Gerard Tickle, he is the Irish writer Gerard Tickle, which is hence why Helen referred to him as Gerard. He hated being called Edward. He was born in Dublin, educated in Tipperary and London. As we rightfully said, he joined the Royal Army Service Corps in 1940 and was commissioned in 1941. Yeah, that's all correct. Thank you very much. He was appointed to the War Office. They obviously don't mention about the, what's it called? What was the place? I see my brain has gone because I'm not working on that case anymore. The place in Liverpool. They mention the War Offices. He was based in Liverpool for most of it. Between 1943 and 45, his duties, this is after the death of Helen Mary Pickering. Duties took him to Africa, the Middle East, Washington DC, Canada, the West Indies and Europe, and he was appointed General Staff in 1945. He was married to the author and physical researcher Renee Haynes. Yeah, so you got that. The daughter of eminent English social moralist E.S.P. Haynes and Oriana Huxley Waller, granddaughter of Thomas Henry Huxley. And they had 3 sons, Crispin, Patrick and Tom. All done. See that? Okay, now Tickell wrote 21 novels, including his best-selling Appointment with Venus in 1951, which was made into a film of the same name starring David Niven. And in 1962, Danish film Venus... Oh, I can't pronounce that. That's in Danish. Blah. See, if I would have rehearsed this, I would know how to pronounce that. He had several non-fiction books, including a memoir of FSOE agent Odette Hallowas, and a history of Winston Churchill's personal transport aircraft. Now, they briefly mention a scandal in there, which is apparently I haven't read it, but apparently a book by Matthew Sweet called The West End Front, which gives details of the family incident, which they call it, and Gerard facing a trial at the Old Bailey, but they don't really go into much details about it. But yeah, so Gerard has 2 surviving sons. One is Sir Crispin Tickell, formerly Britain's permanent representative at the United Nations, and Tom Tickell, former Guardian newspaper columnist. Interesting. Now, George Gerard. Oh, I'm looking at the 2 cases at the same time. Captain Tickell wrote a book called Soldiers from the Wars Returning in 1942, and this was the book that he got his he got the upfront fee from the publisher, and that's the book that he wrote that he used the money to fund the abortion. Interesting. I know. So thanks to Matt C for that. That was a nice little scoop. Obviously, I should have done. I didn't think about searching Gerard Tickell. I just thought Captain Edward Tickell, you would find everything you need there, or Captain Edward Gerard Tickell. But obviously I didn't think about searching Gerard Tickell. But I posted a photo of him on the Murder Mile True Crime Podcast discussion group. It's a photo of Gerard Tickell later in life. It's from the back of his books. Is his author's picture. He looks to be in his early to mid 40s, probably mid 40s ish. So have a look at him there. He's balding. He's got the kind of the tufts around the side of his head. He's got a kind of a pointy nose, and he's got the smug face that you would expect. He's not a super handsome man, but he's probably got the confidence and the charm to carry it off. So I thought that was interesting, even though I won't add this to the end of the other podcast. This is just for you guys to add that there. So obviously if anything crops up in later episodes to do with previous cases, I'll bring it back in. I don't know why I haven't done this. There's Bobby on the Facebook group. Thanks, Bobby. He gave me a new way of ending the show. Unfortunately, I haven't written it here, so I don't know what Bobby said. So I apologise for that. What I'm going to do on this end of this podcast is, because many of you have asked about the music that goes with the podcast. I'm going to do an episode shortly, or when we do the extra miles. I'm going to do 2 episodes, one about the sound effects for Murder Mile and one about the music for Murder Mile. And what I'll do is I'll end this episode by playing you the full version of what is known as Man in a Bag by Cult with No Name. They're the guys who write most of the music for the podcast. And Man in a Bag is the theme tune that you all kind of know, that you're kind of used to by now. But I thought I'd play it in full with the with all the lyrics so you can hear it in full. It's the story of... I should have written it down. I didn't, like an idiot. The analyst, is his name Gareth Jones or Gareth Williams? I think it's Gareth Jones. I'll have to check this out. Who was found inside a bag inside his bedroom in Pimlico only a couple of years ago, and they're not too sure whether it was a sex game gone wrong or whether there were extra information that he had found, because he worked for MI6, so obviously Britain's Secret Service. He was an analyst on that. Whether he'd found out information that he shouldn't have done and then been assassinated by being put into a bag and suffocated. So that's what the story is about. That's what the song is about. Hence it's called Man in a Bag. So I'll play that at the end of this, unless I forget. I'll probably forget. So thank you to everyone for your kind messages about previous episodes, especially the Helen Pickroad episode and the Larry Winters one, which is literally, as I'm recording it now, it's just going out. This is Thursday morning, so the Larry Winters episode is just going out now as I record this. So thank you everyone for your kind messages. It's very much appreciated. As I've said before, being a podcaster is quite a lonely thing. You know, you sit there, I pretend I'm talking to you, but really I'm talking to a microphone right now. And it's many, many, many hours a week just sitting alone, researching alone, writing alone, editing alone. And then you send it out and, you know, it kind of disappears into the ether half the time. So, you know, it's really nice when people take like a couple of seconds or two just to say, hey, I really enjoyed that podcast. It really does give us a lift, and it means a hell of a lot. And obviously over like a year of doing podcasting, I've seen a lot of podcasters just give up. I've seen a lot of them give up. And it's not just because it takes up a lot of time. You know, you're trying to hold down a full-time job and do a podcast as well. But there's a lot of trolls out there, a lot of arseholes who have nothing better to do with their lives than to say to people, you're shit, you're terrible. And do you know what? Some podcasters do take it to heart. Even in my case, like on the first day that I made it into the top of the iTunes top 50, which was very exciting. In that first day, I got 10 1-star reviews. Yeah, I rarely get 1-star reviews, but instantly they were like, "Oh, quick! I hate this." People were like, "I hate this" instantly. It's like just because they were being told by iTunes, "Hey, you should listen to this." So there's a lot of shitbags out there. So conversely, if you have a favourite podcast, tell the podcaster about it. Just, it doesn't matter what forum you use, whether email or on Facebook, or even like it on any of the Facebook forums. Just post on there, hey, I really love this podcast. You know, it really means a lot to them, and it can make the difference between this podcast being there next week and not. It really is a fine line between a podcaster just 1 week just saying, I just can't be arsed anymore. Because don't forget, we don't get paid for this, and it's hard work. So, I need to get a cold drink. That was hard work. Hope you enjoyed that. That was cool, dear. Episode 39. Things are cracking on, aren't they? That's episode 39. Next week's episode was going to be the murder of the boxer Freddie Mills, but the BBC, in their infinite wisdom, have just done a documentary called Murder in Soho. I know, Murder in Soho, the life and death of Freddie Mills. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave my episode a bit. I'm going to let that fester for a bit, let their documentary fester for a bit. I'm going to watch it as well. I want to see what they say about the murder. Some people have fed back to me already and said it wasn't very good. I thought it might be a botch job. And then I will come back with the Freddie Mills episode soon. It's an interesting one. I quite like the case, although I have a very different perspective on what I believe the documentary is. Anyway, that was Murder Mile for, and Extra Mile for episode 39, the murder of George Thomas Pickering. The Murder of Rosa O'Neill by George Thomas Pickering. Hope you enjoyed that. I'm not going to waffle on. I'm going to end it right here. Thank you so much, and I'll see you next week. Bye! Play Cut with No Name music.